Welcome back to the Nick Bartlett Show, everybody. And joining me on the show today is Lars Hanson. Lars covers Washington football for Athlon and is also the co-host of the Locked On Huskies podcast, among some other things. There's some other things too. Thank you for joining me on the show today, Lars.
Oh, it's always good to be with Nick. It's always good to catch up with an old buddy.
Definitely, yeah. Well, I wasn't sure if we were going to include that. No, for sure. So for everyone out there, today we're going to talk about Washington's outlook this season in the midst of just so much change, how the Huskies fare in the Big Ten and the college football landscape in general. So for all you out there, be sure to smash the like and subscribe buttons on YouTube, people. YouTube, I know you see us on Twitter, but we're doing our thing on YouTube too. Without that, let's get straight to the questions. So first question, we're not going to go too in depth here. Just a lot of people have the Huskies predicted pretty solid this year. I personally had no idea what to make of this team with all the turnover. Just what's your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I've been on a couple of shows, and the one thing that really is striking me is I don't think there's ever been a team in college football, and certainly recent memory, that the entire starting 22 basically left in some way, shape, or form. Most of them went to the NFL, a couple went to the transfer portal, but really it's a unique time for Washington, and in a way, it's honestly the perfect clean slate for a new coaching staff to come in, where you're bringing some of your guys from Arizona. We'll talk about Will Rogers later on as well, coming from Mississippi State. But just in this new age of college football, it's actually better to have a clean, fresh start. There's no quarterback. There's a quarterback question, which we'll get into. But it really does kind of give all the new players and even some of the younger players that hadn't gotten a fair shot under Kalen DeBoer and really hadn't gotten any playing time in the past couple of years, a belief that, hey, you know what, this new staff with Steve Belichick on defense, Jed Fish on offense, they might actually get some run this fall. And so there's a lot of guys that decided to stick around for this year that maybe they'll transfer after this season, but they're at least willing to give Jed Fish the shot. He certainly earned it with what he did at Arizona this past season.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he completely switched around Arizona. I mean, people don't really realize how bad Arizona was. I mean, it was just like 5-6 years ago they lost their rivals 70-7. So hopefully we're going to see what happens here at Washington. Next question moving forward here. What should we expect out of Will Rogers this year, and any chance we see Damon Williams?
So I love Will Rogers, just having gotten to see his progression under Mike Leach at Mississippi State, everything he did in the SEC. There's no question when you have 10,000 plus passing yards, you're one of the top passing quarterbacks in the SEC. You're gonna get the chance to start at Washington, even though it's a new coaching staff, because he committed to Kalen DeBoer and Ryan Grubb previously, and elected to stay on with Jed Fish after the two had a meeting, I believe, in mid to late January, because Will was at the first team meeting, but wanted to kind of reassess his options. However, given where most quarterbacks had already made their decision to transfer at that point, it would have been really hard for Will. He would have had to probably go down to the group of five to find a true shot. And there's no reason Will should have done that. And I think Will is the perfect quarterback for what Jed Fish wants to do with the offense, where he wants the ball out quickly. He wants it to get the skill position guys the ball and let them cook, which is exactly what Will Rogers does. And working with the air raid offense that he did with Mike Leach at Mississippi State, he knows how to get the ball out quickly. He's an experienced guy. And the one thing I think that's going to separate Will and Damon, because I do think Damon's going to play at least 5 or 6 games this fall. Most of that's going to be as a backup and maybe in some mop-up action. But certainly in the month of September, I would not be surprised to see Damon Williams play all 3 games against the non-conference schedule, Weber State, Eastern Michigan, and Washington State, just because Will is also coming in relatively new. He didn't show enough in the spring, but part of that was due to the offensive line that he had, where they had, I think, 2 or 3 walk-ons with either the first or second team offense. If that gives you any indication as to what the situation was this past spring, there's no reason to believe that Damon's going to walk into the fall camp and immediately earn the job. But with that being said, I do think Damon offers a different skill set, especially as a running quarterback, a dual threat quarterback. And I will say he does have a good arm. There's no question about that. He has way more zip than Will Rogers does on the ball. There's no question about that. But I think as the true freshman quarterback, you're not going to want to throw Damon right in right away. So I think having such a savvy veteran will help Damon kind of grow over the season. And it's in a way the exact same situation Will Rogers was in his freshman season at Mississippi State when KJ Costello came in. Will and KJ kind of went back and forth. They both played over 6 games that season. It wasn't necessarily the greatest season for Leach that year, but there is a way to which both quarterbacks can get on the field, knowing that Damon is the long-term option since Will's out of eligibility after the season.
Yeah, and I think One thing I think people may not realize down at Basha High School, Chandler, Arizona, Damon Williams threw for over 3,000 yards and ran for 1,000, which is just, I mean, those stats speak for themselves. And then one kind of little caveat question, I probably should have warned you in our little prep here, but I want to ask you, do you think seeing three systems in 3 years will help or hurt Will Rogers? Yeah,
I think it certainly doesn't hurt because if you're a quarterback, all that does is just add to the verbiage that you already know. But given the fact that he had two other systems, that transition is a little bit easier, especially given that he's also a fifth year or sixth year quarterback. Whereas with Damon, he might be having two different coaches, but the verbiage is a lot different. The play level is a lot different. So it's a fair question. I do think there might be a little bit, and that might have been also why the spring looked a little rough, was because Will was trying to learn that new system. But I think when you're a fourth, fifth year quarterback with so much experience that Will has, I don't think there's any uphill challenge in that regard to learn a new system. But I do think that probably is why he struggled a little bit in the spring.
yeah, that's fair. It always takes time. Always takes time. This is why I coach other sports. A lot of work goes into football. So kind of switching tune here. We're not going to do a full roster breakdown right now. If you've been following Washington's schedule at all, really good chance they could start 5-0. Do you see this happening, or Rutgers can maybe get them? Rutgers is pretty solid, and does WSU pose any real threat?
I think those are the perfect games that I think are going to give them the most trouble, because especially that Friday night game going all the way to New Jersey. And Greg Schiano, got to give him credit where credit's due. He's doing enough on the recruiting trail. The one school that he will win at is Rutgers, so I would always say that's going to be a tough one, especially with Jed Fish going back to the East Coast where he's got some ties, I believe, to the New Jersey State. Well, he's from New Jersey, so he's got some ties there as well. He began his football career, shall we say, in Florida and under Steve Spurrier and all that. But he's from the state of New Jersey, so he's got some family there. So I'm sure that's going to be meaningful to him. But that would not be surprised if that's a 4-quarter game where maybe Washington has to kick a game-winning field goal or make a late push at the end. And I think Washington State proved last season against a national championship caliber team, and Washington State went to what bowl game? And I say that respectively. That was a close one for Washington as well. So no doubt, I think, again, obviously not having Cam Ward makes that a little bit different, but I do think that game will always serve some level of motivator for Washington State. So I don't think it's going to be any slouch of a game in that regard. I think Washington probably wins that game, but I don't think it's as easy as people might initially think, similar to last season.
Yeah, and I think I'm with you that it's never a gimme against the Cougs. I think that if you're looking at a more realistic take from my eyes, I think Rutgers is probably going to give him a bigger test. I mean, WC's ranked 83rd in Athlon, and then you're looking at Rutgers, who was in the 40s near Washington. And as you touched on, Greg Schiano's defense only allowed 21.2 points per game last season. And the last kind of thing to throw out there is Rutgers, the Scarlet Knights, also returns the Big Ten leading rusher, and Kyle, I'm not an East Coast guy, so sorry for the name mispronunciation, Kyle Monagai. So you're looking at Rutgers, solid defense, good rushing attack. And they were 7-6 last year, so could give Washington a little trouble. Hopping back to the roster, what do you, just plain and simple, what do you think the Dawgs' offensive identity will be this year?
So that's a really good question, because the only way the offense goes is with a solid offensive line. And that's not to say that it's going to be anywhere near the caliber of what it was last season. And that's no disrespect to Brennan Carroll, because the bodies just aren't there. And the transfers that they got, well, decent on some regard. You're talking about a fifth-year player from Ohio State who started 1 or 2 games. You're talking about a Portland State transfer, D'Angelo Gitialihi. You're talking about a left tackle transfer, the most important position on the offensive line for a right-handed quarterback, hasn't played in over 18 months. So if that gives you any indication of what to expect, I think no doubt Jonah Coleman is going to be a real key factor with this, because if Washington is able to run the ball and just have any semblance of a solid, run blocking system, that'll allow Will Rogers to get a couple of those throws off and have that element of a run and pass, and not, because if Jonah Coleman of the run game can't get going, this offense might be in trouble, because that way then teams are going to be able to start teeing off on Will Rogers. And if you already have questions about the offensive line, that just makes things worse. So I think Jonah Coleman is going to be one of the X factors for Washington this season. I wouldn't be surprised to see him get over, I want to say 1,100 yards, but I'll just say 1,000 to be conservative. But I would not be surprised, because when you're looking at what Washington has, Cam Davis is coming back at running back off an ACL injury, and beyond that, you're looking at some good freshmen. I mean, Sam Adams is there, and then he hasn't done a ton, but he's still there on the team. So this is really Jonah Coleman's team, and we'll see who else can emerge at running back behind him. And I would say Cam Davis would be number two, just out of respect for what he's been able to do in his career at Washington. But given the injuries coming off of, you kind of got to give him the benefit of the doubt to shake off that rust. So he won't be the main back, which is why Jonah Coleman's transfer was so important for Washington.
Yeah, I remember Jonah Coleman being a power rusher at Arizona. Surprised me a little bit. You think Jonah Coleman's going to be the guy a little bit more than Jeremiah Hunter?
I do, because I think if Jeremiah Hunter is going to be the guy where he might have more touchdowns, like he might lead the team in touchdowns, but I'm not sure. This is where Jed Fish's offense and the skill position players that Washington has. I think Jeremiah certainly is a great talent. I'm not. There's no discrediting Jeremiah, but I honestly, I'm bigger on Denzel Boston than I am on Jeremiah Hunter. But partially that's also because I know how good Denzel has been in practice the past couple of years, and let's be fair, Cal's quarterback situation has not been friendly to Jeremiah Hunter the past couple of seasons. So he's getting the benefit of the doubt there. And what we saw in spring was a guy that can high point the ball in that regard in the end zone. So I think he'll certainly have an impact. It's a good problem to have if your debate is Denzel Boston, Jeremiah Hunter, or Jonah Coleman, because that means you have enough pieces, and there's still plenty of guys that that nobody even knows about, and that I haven't even truly been able to assess that could actually be contributors this fall as well.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why I asked about kind of the offensive identity, because like you mentioned, there's definite pieces, and I think back to, like, I know NCAA football is all the rage. I was a bigger Madden guy, nerdy Madden guy, and I think of, like, how would I play with Washington's hypothetically if they were in Madden? It's like you got a rushing back, a really solid receiver. Obviously, the line's going to be wait and see, and a solid quarterback. So I'm not sure exactly how that's going to play out, but the pieces are there. That's really kind of the safest way to say it, and I guess we will stick with the roster, keep it a little traditional today. I already apologize. This is going to be a long-winded question, Lars. So Washington's defense has some question marks and a few returners. I'm concerned about them losing all four starters on the defensive line. Will this unit be strong enough to hold their own in the Big Ten? And how will the defense fare overall?
It's a $1 million question, because you got probably one of the greatest defensive names running your defense in Steve Belichick. Obviously, it's not Bill. It's Bill's the architect in New England. Or Bill was the architect in New England, if we're being fair. But Steve certainly played a role in that, and I'm really curious to see kind of how he builds his own defense. Because again, in a way, we're talking about it's a clean slate. You're talking about Sebastian Valdez coming in from Montana State, Javon Parker and Jacob Bannis are really the only two experienced guys that are on the team returning. On the interior, I should say. You have Zach Durfee on the edge, where he got shafted by the NCAA. I don't know if I could say that, but I'm just going to say that because I think I can. That's safe to say. It's safe to say, right? But either way, no, Durfee's a kid where I think he has so much motivation coming into this season. He's a real quiet kid in that regard, but I think he's kind of that true Midwestern blue collar. I'm just going to come in and get after it. And so if he's able to really come along, especially early on in the season, that will quell some nerves. But the real concern for me is that interior, because all the transfers that they brought in, we're talking Deshaun Lynch from Sacramento State, who played edge but could play as a 3 technique for Washington this fall. Logan Sagapolu, a Miami offensive lineman who hasn't played defense nose tackle since his junior and senior year in high school in Utah, like 5, 6, 7 years ago now at this point. Now he's going to flip back over to defense. So there's a lot of potential, and I like the addition because he's Logan Sagapolu is 6'2", 6'3", 368 pounds. I love it on paper. But how does it actually translate on the field, and who's going to have to emerge? There's a lot of young pieces there where you got Russell Davis coming in from Arizona. Isaiah Ward is an edge coming in from Arizona. Linneus Davis is a redshirt freshman who came in with an injury last season. Actually, weirdly enough, has the highest strength. Call back to your EA25 point. Has the highest strength of any player on the team. Hasn't played a game at Washington. I am really curious. This is no disrespect to Linneus, because he also is an accomplished, basketball player, and I believe he also threw discus and javelin in high school as well. So he's clearly strong, and you can kind of see he's got a good frame. But I'm just curious how you assess a 97 strength, or that high of a strength, without having played a game. So if he's able to, but in that regard, if EA is right and he's able to emerge, that'll also cause some nerves. But again, this just gets back to the whole all the pieces are there. They did a good job getting the pieces in place, but how does it come together? I think that's where Steve Belichick's going to make his money, because as interesting as he is as a recruiter, he was solely brought in here to run an NFL defense, and that's his expectation. But in spring, when we talked to him, and again, obviously this is the classic Belichick response, but sounding just like his dad, he's like, yeah, like these guys are good, just trying to evaluate them, don't really know what to say other than that. And it's like, yeah, he's not going to say a whole ton because A, he doesn't know most of these guys, and B, the ones that he does know, the ones that I just mentioned, Jacob Bandis, Javon Parker, and Sebastian coming in from Montana State, that's not a whole lot to go off of. So I think when we get a chance to talk to him in fall camp here in the next couple of 3-4 weeks, or when they get camp going, it'll be interesting to see how his understanding of this team is growing, because Jason Kafusi did a really good job at Arizona developing a versatile mix of defensive linemen. He seems to be better as an edge rusher coach in terms of developing edge rushers, but I think he's just as capable with the interior guys. So I'm just curious to see how that tandem is going to work, because my fear is 2021 Washington. I'm not saying it's going to be that bad, but I still, just having covered that team and watching that game against Michigan and Ann Arbor in 21, where it was a 2-4-5 defense. 2 down defensive linemen, 4 linebackers, and 5 defensive backs. They did a great job against the pass, didn't really get burned there, but they got absolutely ran over by Michigan. And that was 21 Michigan. That wasn't 23 Michigan. So given that, I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, but there's, again, so many question marks along that front four. I think Sebastian's going to do well. Javon, I'm a pretty big fan of. I think he's going to emerge well, especially as a pass rusher in the interior. But it's about the depth, because when you're going to the Big Ten, this is the one thing that Pac-12 fans won't like to hear. It is a much, much, much different conference, where you're facing Cal, Stanford, Arizona, Oregon State. Now you're facing Rutgers, Michigan, Northwestern, Iowa, and you can pick your 15, even Michigan State, which Washington has throttled the last couple of years. These are all still really tough outs that are much different than they were in the Pac-12. So you have to have that depth, and technically speaking, experience-wise, they don't have that coming into the season, so they're going to have to develop that early on, which is why the month of September is so important for this team.
Yeah, no, and there was obviously we're a West Coast based site, so I'm not going to elaborate on that too much, but I think that's the honest take. If you've watched Big Ten or SEC football the last couple of years, the conference was at a higher level. I remember me and my dad were watching a game, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and it was obvious. It's unfortunate. There's still some great players on the West Coast. I mean, obviously, we're both sitting here talking the Dawgs, but there is a reality to the teams in the Big Ten. And you actually led me to my next question. I love when it happens like that. It's the beautiful thing of this industry. So really, exactly, what matchup scary? Actually, before I do that, because I think you were a little modest there. There are some really solid players on the Dawgs. I obviously touched on, or asked about the defensive line. But if you're looking kind of at the linebackers and secondary, you're returning Carson Bruner, 86 tackles last year. Alfonso Tupatala, 69 tackles. Obviously, you lost Jabbar Muhammad in the secondary, but you return senior safety Cameron Fibik-Yalanen and junior cornerback Elijah Jackson. I'm not going to even try and say Prysock's first name, the transfer cornerback from Arizona. So there are some pieces in the linebacker and secondary core. So there's definitely some playmakers. You want to add anything there before we move ahead, or?
No, yeah, I think Prysock really caveats the loss of Muhammad, because that is without question a significant loss, and the fact that he went to Oregon, just shout out to him for that. But he also didn't have any ties to Washington before this year, so you can't. I'm somebody where if you didn't start out at Washington and you happen to come to Washington, you can transfer wherever you want to do. You did your job as a mercenary. The one guy that I'm really intrigued to see come through in the secondary is Justin Harrington, the Oklahoma transfer, because he's a guy that really seemed like he was ready to pop at Oklahoma before he tore his ACL last season. If he can emerge, and this is what is intriguing to me, we're talking 6'3" Prysock on the outside, 6'3" Harrington at nickel, and a 6'1" or 6'2" cornerback, whether it's Elijah Jackson or Thaddeus Dixon, the JUCO junior or senior. I've honestly lost track of his eligibility at this point, but either one of those guys, you're talking about 6 foot and above, and I'm talking truly 6 foot, so 6'1" and above, not 5'11" listed at 6 foot. Tall cornerbacks who can be physical across the field. I think that's going to be the saving grace. And to me, yeah, Carson Bruner's the team captain, highlight, all that. Like Carson is going to be probably the shining star on this defense. That's not necessarily a hot take, but just a conservative, easy take to say, you know what, Carson's honestly probably going to be the one that's setting up this entire defense because he had the helmet mic this past spring. There was a couple of players that had it, but I would not be surprised if Carson's the one just setting up the defense, which will be good given that he's got so much experience doing. He doesn't have his starting experience doing it, but he's got enough experience where he again comes from a football family. Mark Bruner's his father, scout for the Steelers, played at Washington, great tight end in the NFL. So he knows exactly what to do, and I think that's going to be a real key for Washington. Is if they didn't have the linebacker experience, then I would be a lot more concerned. So I think the back end really does help save the front end in that regard.
Yeah, and now what you're talking about previously, when you go back to the schedule and how the Big Ten is, no, there's no other way to say it. The Big Ten, there's a little more depth in the Pac-12. RIP Pac-12, all love. But and so looking at the back half of the Dawgs schedule, what matchup scare you the most? You got Oregon, Penn State, Michigan. Like you said, take your pick.
Yeah, the one that I'm going to be in Happy Valley for that one. So I would say Penn State just for everything that game represents. And again, I said this on a Locked On show where I actually picked Oregon the other day. So I'm going to basically cancel out what I just said a couple of days ago because again, you can't pick really between those two schools because Oregon, there's a rivalry there. And in a way, having that game as the last game of the season to replace the Apple Cup is more fitting because that was the true. Sorry to say this, was the true rivalry, but in the Northwest region, especially just with the competitive nature of those two schools, both likely try to make the playoff this year. Oregon probably will make the playoff. Washington won't, but schools that it just was a different level of competition. Similarly, with the Pac-12, where it's like just that Washington State rivalry was not necessarily the same as the Oregon rivalry, but they're all still important games in that regard. But that's why the whiteout game for me is really important because if Washington is somehow, some way able to win that game, they can lose to Oregon. They can honestly lose to Michigan because that win in University Park at Beaver Stadium means so much more, especially in year one of the Big Ten for Jedd Fisch, knowing that when the next time Penn State comes out. Because here's the thing, Washington's 0-3 against Penn State all time. 35-28 in the Fiesta Bowl, 13-10 way back when, and I forgot what the first score was, but it was even further back than 1987, so no disrespect to the old folk out there, but we'll just kind of brush that one aside. But it's still a loss. So if Jedd Fisch can come in and win against Penn State, and I will say Penn State, great defense. I think there's no question about that. The question for Penn State is going to be on offense. If Washington's strength is defense and the offense is what it is, that might actually lend itself in Washington's favor. So I'll be really intrigued. So I would rank it probably Penn State, Oregon, Michigan. The Michigan game is not as appealing as it once was because, again, both teams are going to be new from the 24 national championship game, and it's not going to be Washington won. Now it's a 1-1 match, or now it's 1-2 or whatever, or 1-2 because they lost in 21. I think to me that Michigan game still matters, but the Penn State one matters more.
Yeah, Michigan in a rebuild, and anytime is it Happy Valley? Is that what they call it out there in Penn State?
So I always thought it was Happy Valley. It's the technical location is University Park, I believe. Beaver Stadium, obviously, is the safest bet there. But I always thought it was Happy Valley. But at least that's what it used to be called. I don't know if that changed or went away, but I swear that's what it used to be called.
Yeah, for sure. And then, all right, moving forward here. This is a question I always ask as I kind of round out the show. Who's your favorite player on this team? Doesn't have to be the best, doesn't have to be the worst. Just, someone you enjoyed watching a little bit in the spring.
So I'm going to cheat and give you two answers. One, the true answer, because the one that I've been able to see to answer your full question is Jonah Coleman, the running back from Arizona. He just has and this is going to lead into my second answer, because having not played a single down at Washington, he's been one of the more essential guys on the team in terms of official visitor recruits and playing host to recruits, both transfers and high school guys. Which leads me to the guy that I also would say is a 1B in that regard, is Maximus Secrete, the left tackle from Iowa Central, had a cup of coffee in Maryland. He has a really cool backstory. I talked to him a couple months after his commitment, just before he enrolled at Washington. He ended up because he explained because I was really curious. I'm like, wait, why did you only play 2 games at Maryland after being a two-time JUCO All-American? Unfortunately, he had some family stuff come up back home. His mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, and around the same time, unfortunately, his father also had a severe injury to his back. So Maximus had to go back to Missouri to help out his family, and he worked 2 jobs. And we're talking civilian jobs. We're not talking high school football coach and TV analyst or whatever. He was working at a plastic wrapping factory and he was working at a grocery outlet, kind of a grocery. I'm trying to think. It wasn't a Hy-Vee. It was one of those other. It was I think Dawgs or whatever Midwestern one it was. But it was really cool to see a kid where it almost. I actually, it was funny. I asked him, I'm like, do you know the Kurt Warner story where he was bagging groceries, ends up getting a call, UFL arena, et cetera, ends up being a Hall of Fame quarterback. Somehow fell through the cracks that Maximus didn't know that story. So that's a failure on the Iowa education system to not everybody. I feel like if you're a football player from the state of Iowa, you should probably know the Kurt Warner story, but that's just my personal opinion. But Maximus is such a good kid, and he's just such an interesting kid. I think if you ever get to meet him or just be around him, there's certain kids where, and I don't say kid as like little kid because he's a massive guy, but he's a avid, not, I don't want to say avid hunter, but he loves dogs, and he's got a couple of pit bulls that he does take care of very well. We had a good heart to heart conversation about that because I also love pit bulls, having had one. And he just, to me, I think when people get around him, he is going to be a big fan favorite. But the ironic part is one of his hosts for the visit was Jonah Coleman, and the way he described Jonah Coleman was like, "Who's our star running back?" Jonah Coleman hasn't taken a snap at Washington yet. We're already calling him a star running back. So if that gives you any indication to kind of tie everything together of why I believe that Jonah Coleman, to have a call back to my earlier answer of why he's going to be so important, is the same reason that Maximus is going to be, because Washington has got a lot of young left tackles and a former two-time JUCO All-American who hasn't played in 18 months. To say that's going to be an interesting position battle in fall camp is an understatement. But I think his personality and his violent nature when he does put his helmet on, I think is going to shine through. And so I think in that regard, those would be my 2 picks. And again, that's not to slight anybody else on defense, because I think I could probably give you 20 or 30 names of guys that I just love talking to on this team that are great kids. Cam Fab, Carson Bruner, Ephesians Price Talk, to answer your question. He goes by Effie or EP, but his name is Ephesians Price Talk. Elijah Jackson has a great background story. There's so many. Zach Durfee's a great kid to talk to. There's so many guys on this team that just have great stories, and so it's going to be a really unique season ahead for Jedd Fisch because there's so much potential with this team, which is why I'll give you a free one here. I have them going 8-4, 9-3, somewhere in that ballpark. They're not a 6-win team. At best, they're a 9-win team with a bowl win, because when you look at that, you think, wow, how do you go from a national championship to 8-4, and you say that's a successful season? Tell me what TCU did when they went to the playoff and lost, or when they fell apart. And I don't even know what they're looking like this season. I'll just be completely honest. Whereas Washington, you can see the pieces are there more so for 2025 and 26 with Damon Williams and a lot of the younger players. But there's enough veteran presence on this team with those young guys. And Jedd Fisch is going to play a lot of freshmen this year. I'll tell you that much. Jedd is not going to be shy about playing freshmen. So there's going to be a lot of guys to see time this season. It's just going to be a question of who is going to shine when, and what will that look like in terms of how many wins can that garner? Because at worst, this is a 6-6 team. I would more so lean on 7-5 because I just can't see that other 6 loss. But with that being said, injuries come up. So they're in an interesting position, but it's certainly a good position to be in, knowing that you have all the pieces there. And it's just got to – and I'll give Jedd Fisch credit. And one last thing, we'll kind of wrap it up on this. I ran into Jedd Fisch the last 2 Pac-12 media days, and this back after Kalen DeBoer was hired at Washington. And I'm like, man, I was a believer in you from the beginning. If you ever have the chance to come up to Washington, I think you would be a great fit. And it worked out perfectly. So I told him something else that didn't come to fruition that time because I mentioned the former center that's now at Alabama. But I think Jedd's the right guy to lead this program for what Kalen did. And I'm just really intrigued to see how it all comes together, because it could be really good. It's not going to be 10 wins. It's not going to be a playoff team, even at their best. I mean, again, I would love to be proven wrong in that regard, but I think this is certainly a team that should, if you're looking at the FanDuel odds, I believe it's 7.5. So I would take the over there. It's going to be a really good team. The question is, will the quarterback that starts the season, will Rodgers be the one that ends it? I think that might also be a key indicator as to what happens this fall for Washington.
Yeah, and this is going back to I got to stick back with the point you made a while ago. People saying, how could Washington win 8, 9 games? I feel is a pretty realistic take. Sometimes you do, you interview reporters and they might kind of balloon their school up there. That feels pretty realistic. But to answer your question about what happened at TCU, they put Deion Sanders on the map and lost to Colorado to open up last season. So that's what happened to them after they won the national championship. Not exactly sure how the rest of their season turned out. We don't cover TCU, but I can tell you that Colorado was not a major player in the Pac-12, and I'll leave it at that. Um,
Yeah,
so
it's funny. I remember telling a UW parent's mom, I won't reveal who it was, but she asked me about what my thoughts were on Dion that last June, and I'm like, you know what? I would not be surprised if he wins 2 or 3 of his first games and then don't look at the rest of the schedule. And it's exactly what happened. Where Dion, you knew that wave of energy coming in, and TCU was a little overhyped coming off that national championship run. So they were very gettable games, similar to where Washington's at, where you can get Eastern Michigan, you can get Washington State, you can get Weber State, and honestly, you might be able to get Rutgers as well. But beyond that, that's when you get into the meat of the Big Ten schedule, and that's what's really going to determine the season.
yeah, for sure, the Big Ten. There's a reason, them in the SEC, they're the guys. So last question here, kind of just the same question I always end with. Anything else that you'd like to add about the Huskies? Anything I missed? You could add something about the Big Ten or just the college football landscape in general.
So I am very happy that we're now at 12 teams in the playoffs. I think college football it's never going to be what it used to be. Even if 10 years from now we go and look that the Pac-12 reforms because teams hate traveling so much. Really, we're getting to a point where you're going to have 64 teams in a major league of college football, basically double the amount for the NFL, and that way you're going to have a kind of a tiered system of college football in this country, where you'll have the cream of the cream, but you'll still have guys going to the NFL. You're always going to have guys going to the NFL from D2, D3. There's always teams in the NFL that find guys some way, shape, or form. So college football, I think, is more so going to evolve, and people are just going to have to accept that. It's never going to die. It's never going to become AAA. It's never going to become semi-pro. And I say that knowing players are getting paid and all that. They should have been getting paid to begin with. I'm not saying they should be getting some of the money that's reported. Also, some of the money being reported is wildly overmarked. I'll just say that much. But with that being said, I think college football is still in a good spot because have we been talking about college football? I mean, we've been talking about it consistently over the past couple of decades, but it really seems like college football just keeps climbing and climbing and climbing in the pantheon of respects to other sports in this country. Where I think there's more college football fans than baseball fans, depending on what city you're in, and especially across the country. So college football will always be there. It's never going to become the minor leagues, but in a way, it's evolving to that. But in a way, that just helps the sport grow because we've seen how many coaches from the NFL go back to college. Steve Belichick going from the NFL to college as a first-time defensive play caller. There's so many different things at play, and we also would be remiss if we're not saying the first time that Nick Saban's not a coach in college football. I mean, everybody's got a fair shot now. Kirby Smart's obviously got the head start there in that regard, but Oregon's trying to do their best to get Phil Knight a national championship before he dies. Shout out to him for that. But with that being said, there's a lot. Again, if you don't like college football and what it's become, I understand that. But at the same point, I would implore fans who have that belief to give this new era of college football another shot. Just see what happens this season. See how the Big Ten looks with Washington traveling to the East Coast on a Friday night. You now have Iowa at Washington and Texas at Ole Miss or whatever it happens to be. Just crazy. The things that we never thought we would hear 5-10 years ago are now coming to fruition, which honestly makes the sport way more appealing than having the same old year in and year out. That's how you change the sport and evolve the sport, is you kind of have to mix it up. And this is just the evolution of college football.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're just looking at it, obviously I'll take the West Coast lens. Even with obviously you're talking about these big time matchups. There's even schools and like non-traditional fan bases that are still really passionate. You look at a team like Boise State. You look at a team like Fresno State. You look at a team like San Diego State. obviously you got the Pac-2 schools, and they're, along with all these big games, you got teams right now in this next 2-year window literally vying for their potential futures. There's no other way. Are they going to be the big Power Four in those 64 team leagues? Are they going to be the group of 5 or group of 4, group of 3, group of 1, whatever it comes? So this really is an interesting time. Change is a part of life. I was a little upset at first with all the changes, but hey, we're gonna have some good games this year. And though, and so kind of closing out the show here, I just wanted to thank you for coming on again, Lars. Appreciate your time, man.
Always, Nick. It's always good to talk about the Huskies, even though our alma mater would like us to talk about them. It is what it is.
Lars, all right. I wasn't sure if I'm going to say it, so now I got to. So whatever I wrote is probably about to change, but this part I wrote, to be fair, but as a kid who grew up in Seattle, Shoreline, everyone Shoreline, that's North Seattle. I seriously always enjoy talking a little Husky football. I grew up a Husky fan, obviously before I went to, my alma mater, which I'm sure you guys know what that is. And then a quick story about Lars. I wasn't sure, if we were going to act like we knew each other before this. Got to say, he is a real one, and this is real because I went to college twice at that school that isn't Washington, and essentially I went back like a little bit older, like a little bit older college student. Lars was like that guy who's like, hey man, you want to come to my fraternity? It was all love. He invited me, and like him, and I'm gonna shout out a guy named Jackson as well. We're just like two really friendly people, and again, it just not a lot of people would do that, being just a little bit older guy in college. So I appreciated that. Had a good time in his place. It was all love. There were no fights. There were no fraternity brothers trying to throw me out. It just I played. I just had fun. You know what I mean? I had fun. So yeah, I want to say Lars is a real one, and I always appreciated that, man.
You as well, Nick.
Yep. And then for you guys can all follow Lars at Lars Hanson on X, and again, that is at LarsHanson. And yeah, thank you guys for watching, and everyone stay yourself.